welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Man in the 20s. I used to bartend at a small but popular restaurant downtown. The kind of place where locals would come for comfort food, and the owners always tried to maintain a cozy, familiar atmosphere. Fridays were always the busiest, filled with regulars, first dates, families, and occasional celebrity sightings. But once the last customer left and the restaurant doors were locked, my real shift would begin. My primary duty on Friday nights was to close down the place, which meant making sure everything was cleaned, all the lights were turned off, the cash register was counted, and the doors were securely locked. The restaurant wasn't big, but it had a very particular layout. The kitchen was connected to the dining area by a narrow hallway, and the office where we kept the cash was near the back of the restaurant, just past the kitchen. The most memorable part of the night, however, was always the last step, counting the money. It had a ritualistic quality to it. Everything had to be done just right. On most nights, I would turn off half the lights before heading to the office. Enough so I could see, but not too much to make it feel like the restaurant was still alive. It was a calming, almost meditative task, despite the eerie quiet that always settled in after hours. But that night, something was different. I remember it clearly. The evening had gone smoothly. The last customers had finished their meals, said their goodbyes, and left. I cleared the bar and moved toward the back, switching off lights as I went. The glow from the kitchen was dim, casting long shadows across the floor. I could feel the usual stillness settling in around me, the kind that only happens in empty spaces. As I walked through the kitchen, I passed by the door that led to the dining area. It was cracked open slightly, just enough for me to see part of the room beyond. I remember looking over, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone sitting at one of the tables in the back section. It was the table area we referred to as the 20s, because of the numbered seating arrangement. The table in question was near the windows, where the faint light from outside filtered through. The person looked like an older man, hunched over slightly, almost as if he was waiting for someone. I froze for a moment. The restaurant had been empty since closing time. No one was supposed to be here. I quickly turned my head, but when I looked back, there was no one there. The chair at the table was empty, the room silent. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I'd just caught a glimpse of something from the corner of my eye. I continued on my way, heading to the office to count the cash. My hands were steady, though my mind kept drifting back to the image of the man sitting alone in the dimly lit room. The next morning, I arrived early to open the restaurant. It was routine: unlock the doors, check the supply closets, get the kitchen ready. The server working with me was a woman named Sarah. She had worked at the restaurant on and off for years, so she was one of the few who could handle the place without getting frazzled. As I walked through the dining area, I mentioned casually, "You won't believe what happened last night." Sarah glanced up at me, her expression calm as usual. "What happened?" I could have sworn I saw someone in the 20s section. I mean, no one was supposed to be here, but I thought I saw an older man sitting at one of the tables. When I went to check, he was gone. She didn't seem surprised in the least. Without missing a beat, she said, "Oh yeah, the man in the 20s section. He likes hanging out there." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. What do you mean? The man? Sarah nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. Yeah. He's been here for as long as I can remember. Comes by late at night, sits there, and just waits. Some nights, he'll be there. Other nights, he won't. No one knows who he is. But we all know about him. I stared at her, feeling a chill run down my spine. Wait, you've seen him too? I asked, my voice a little shaky. Oh, everyone has. He's harmless. Just an old guy who likes to hang around, I guess. But something in her tone didn't sit right with me. There was an underlying knowingness in her voice, as though she was more familiar with the man than she was letting on. My stomach tightened. I had never heard anyone mention this before. No one had ever mentioned a ghost or a spirit in the restaurant. But the way Sarah spoke about it, like it was an everyday occurrence, made me uneasy. Has anyone ever asked the owners about him? I asked cautiously. Sarah shrugged. I don't think they know. Or if they do, they don't say anything about it. You get used to it after a while. No one bothers him, and he doesn't bother anyone. I didn't know what to think. The more Sarah spoke, the more the weight of her words sank in. It felt as though I had stepped into a conversation about something far older than the restaurant itself. Something strange and unsettling had been lingering in the background for years, and now it seemed to be creeping into my reality. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the building. I had a busy shift ahead, and for the most part, everything went according to plan. But as the night wore on and the restaurant emptied out, the feeling of being watched grew more intense. It was subtle at first, just a small tingling at the back of my neck. But as the minutes stretched on, it became harder to ignore. When the last customer left and I began the usual closing routine, I felt it again, the odd sensation that someone was there. It was a quiet presence, one that made the air around me seem thick, heavy. As I walked through the dining area, past the 20 section, I couldn't help but glance over at the table where the man had sat the night before. This time, the table was empty, but it felt different. Like something was waiting. Something invisible, but very much present. I quickly turned off the lights and made my way to the office, the silence of the restaurant pressing down on me with every step. The door to the dining area was still cracked open, and in the darkness, I thought I could see the faintest outline of a figure. The man. His shape was hazy, almost translucent, but there. Watching. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to finish my work. I couldn't let fear take over. But my hands were shaking as I counted the money, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds. The man in the 20s section. I couldn't escape the thought. The next morning, I spoke to Sarah again, my mind still reeling from the night before. I need to know more about this man, I said. Why is he here? How long has he been coming? Sarah looked at me, her expression unreadable. You really want to know? I nodded, not sure what I was hoping for, but I had to know. Something was drawing me in. Something I couldn't explain. He was here before the restaurant even opened, Sarah said softly. Some say he was a regular, always sitting at that same spot. But one night, he didn't leave. The owners say he just disappeared. Some people think he never really left. That he's still here, waiting for something. But no one knows for sure. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I stared at her. I didn't know if I should believe her. But the unease in my gut told me something was very wrong. The man in the 20s section. Whoever or whatever he was, I had no doubt he wasn't just a figment of my imagination. That night, as I prepared to close down the restaurant, I felt the familiar tension creeping back. But this time, I wasn't as scared. I had come to accept that there was something more to the restaurant than just its walls and floors. Something that lingered in the shadows. Something old. Something that had been waiting for a long, long time. And I wondered, as I turned off the last light in the dining area, if the man would be there again tonight. Story: The Haunting at Grayhill Farm. It was a quiet, cold night at Grayhill Farm, and I was sitting in the office of the horse ranch, looking out the small window at the sprawling acres of land. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, almost ghostly light over the barns and paddocks. The place was silent, save for the occasional rustling of hay in the wind, the distant bleating of sheep, and the soft snorting of the horses from the stables. I was 24 at the time, 6 feet tall, a woman with broad shoulders and strong hands, someone who had earned the nickname Amazonian among my coworkers. I'd worked at Grayhill for over a year now, handling horses, cleaning stables, feeding them, and, when necessary, collecting horse semen for artificial insemination. It was grueling work, often late into the night, but it was honest, and I loved the animals. The horses were beautiful, magnificent creatures, thoroughbreds mostly, bred for shows and races. That night, I was working alone on a night shift. My coworker had called in sick, which was rare. Usually, we'd rotate shifts, taking care of the horses at night while the farm was quiet. I didn't mind the solitude. It was peaceful, but sometimes a bit lonely. My main tasks that night were to ensure all the horses were fed, watered, and settled into their stalls. I had just finished setting up the hay nets when I heard the first scream. It was coming from the mare's stable. I froze, unsure of what I was hearing. Horses are dramatic, sure, but this was different. This wasn't the usual neighing or whinnying you'd hear when a horse was agitated. This was something much more urgent, much more disturbing. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and ran down the corridor toward the stables. The mare in question was one of our older thoroughbreds, a beautiful chestnut with a white, star-shaped marking on her forehead. Her name was Lady. As I approached her stable, I could hear her frantically screaming, her hooves pounding against the stone floor. When I reached the stable door, I found it securely locked, both top and bottom as usual, but I could see Lady inside, rearing up in panic, her body twitching with distress. I immediately unlocked the door, stepped inside, and quickly moved toward her. She was thrashing about, her eyes wide with terror. I had to be careful. Her powerful legs could easily knock me over, and if she kicked me, it could do serious damage. I tried to calm her, speaking gently, but she was beyond reason. I barely managed to get close enough to check her over before I saw it. She had a massive gash on her leg, the blood dark and fresh, soaking into the hay beneath her. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I moved to examine her further, I noticed a deep, jagged cut on her rump. It looked almost like a cat scratch, but far too large. The wound was deep, and the flesh around it was burnt, as though it had been seared by something hot. I couldn't understand it. There were no signs of fire, no heat source in the stable. Lady was clearly in pain, but there was no immediate sign of what had caused the injury. I managed to get her out of the stable and into the temporary holding area near my office. She Was still bleeding heavily, and I knew I needed to act fast. I grabbed some absorbent dressings and tried to stop the bleeding, but it was relentless. Within moments, I was covered in blood, trying desperately to keep her calm and stable until help arrived. The vet was on call, but I knew it would take time for them to get here. The nearest clinic was about an hour away, and it was too late in the night to expect them to arrive quickly. I looked out the window, watching Lady as she stood there, breathing heavily and trembling. Something was wrong. Something didn't feel right. I walked over to the security system and pulled up the cameras. We had a network of cameras scattered around the ranch, inside the barns, stables, paddocks, and the main gate. I started by reviewing footage from the time the incident had occurred, around 2 a.m. The cameras near the gate showed nothing unusual, just the guard dogs lying in their area, calm as ever. They were well trained, used to the presence of the staff, and would usually only bark at strangers or perceived threats. But then, at 3 a.m., something changed. The guard dogs began barking, not at the gate but at seemingly nothing. They were running in all directions, growling and howling, but they never left their area. I rewound the footage to see if I could find any explanation. The dogs were huddling together, frightened and skittish. There was nothing on the footage to explain why they were acting this way. Next, I checked the camera facing the cattle barn. The cattle were calm, grazing as usual, but at 3:06 a.m., they suddenly huddled together in a circle, acting strangely. They stampeded to the far corner of the barn, clearly agitated by something invisible to the camera. My stomach churned. I couldn't explain any of this. There was no sign of a predator, no animals, no intruders. Just the strange behavior of the livestock. I moved on to the camera facing the mare's stable. Everything looked calm at first, but then, at 3:07 a.m., the feed in the stable seemed to move on its own, as if a draft had blown through the area. I leaned in closer to the monitor, but I couldn't see anything. Then, Lady began screaming again, more frantically than before. I watched as she bucked in her stall, her eyes wide with terror. But then, something appeared. Two glowing eyes. They weren't attached to anything. No body, no creature, just these eerie, glowing eyes. Hovering in midair, reflecting the light from the stable. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. I rewound the footage, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But when I played it again, the eyes were gone, and the stable was empty. There was no sign of any creature or intruder. Then, something worse happened. As I watched the footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A puff of condensation, like the breath of something cold, appeared right behind me in the camera feed. I had been standing there in the office, oblivious to it. Completely unaware that whatever was in the stable was now behind me. I jumped back from the monitor, my heart racing. I couldn't explain it. I was alone in the office. There was no one else in the building. I turned back to look at Lady. Her breathing had slowed, but the wounds were still bleeding. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. By the time the vet arrived, I was a wreck. I showed them the footage, and they seemed as spooked as I was. They treated Lady the best they could, but despite their efforts, she went into septic shock. We had to put her down. It was a heartbreaking decision. I'd never forget the look in her eyes when she finally stopped fighting. The vet left in a hurry, muttering something about needing a break after a night like this. I wasn't surprised. The whole incident felt wrong. But that wasn't the end of it. That night, I asked if I could have one of the patrol dogs with me. The dog I was given was a Malinois, a breed known for its intelligence and protective instincts. But when I approached the dog, it immediately began growling and backing away. This was a dog that had worked alongside us for years, and it had never acted like this. The dog was terrified. It refused to stay near me. I spent the rest of the night in the office, the dog refusing to enter, pacing anxiously outside. I didn't sleep at all. Every creak of the building, every whisper of whine through the barn, seemed amplified in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something that wanted me to leave. When the morning shift arrived, I showed the footage to the other workers. They were just as spooked as I was. The cameras had captured something unexplainable. In the following weeks, the ranch hired armed security. No one knew what had happened, and the owners didn't want to take any chances. We all thought it was over. But I couldn't shake the fear. A few months later, I quit. I couldn't stand the thought of being there anymore. The unease, the feeling that something was watching me, never left. I didn't want to know if it happened again. I didn't want to find out what was lurking out there on the ranch. And to this day, I wonder if the strange occurrences at Grey Hill were ever truly explained, or if they were just the beginning of something far darker. Story: The Haunting of Hawthorne Mall. I had never been particularly superstitious, but something about Hawthorne Mall always gave me a chill. I worked there as a private security guard, patrolling the vast, empty hallways at night, keeping an eye on the stores, checking the security cameras, and making sure everything was in order. My partner, Derek, and I worked the night shifts, a task most of the other security guards avoided. But for some reason, we didn't mind. At least, we didn't mind at first. Hawthorne Mall was a sprawling, old place, built back in the 80s, and it had its fair share of stories. Every mall has its ghosts, right? But the ones at Hawthorne weren't just whispered rumors, they were real. It didn't take long for Derek and me to pick up on the strange vibes that seemed to permeate certain areas of the building. We both had this uneasy feeling that the place was haunted. It was more than just an eerie atmosphere, it was a palpable presence. A feeling that clung to the walls and floors, as if the mall itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The story that everyone talked about was the homicide that occurred just before I was hired. A man was murdered in the western end of the mall, right outside a store that had long since closed down. Nobody knew exactly what happened, but it was messy, and the police never really solved the case. There were rumors of strange things happening in that area after the murder, lights flickering, cold spots, and whispers that no one could trace. I'd only been working at Hawthorne for a couple of months when I started to sense that something wasn't right, especially on the west side of the mall. It was strange. The western section of the mall was rarely visited, especially at night. The stores in that area were old, abandoned, or had been shut down for years. The food court near the west entrance had become a ghost town. There were only a few stores still open, and even they closed early. I couldn't figure out why, but the west side always felt colder, emptier. It didn't matter if it was summer or winter, the chill always seemed to linger there. It was as if the air itself was different. One night, after Derek had left for the night shift, I was tasked with walking the rounds alone. It was about 2 a.m., and the mall was as quiet as a tomb. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above me was the only sound as I walked through the halls. I reached the west side of the mall, and as I passed by the long, empty hallway that stretched down to the abandoned shops, I felt it, a sudden, inexplicable pressure on my chest, as though the air was too thick to breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I paused for a moment, staring down the dark corridor. I could see the faint outline of the closed shops, their metal grills drawn down. The lights flickered above me, casting brief shadows along the walls. My eyes were drawn to the windows at the far end of the hall. I always hated walking past them at night. They were wide, glass windows, the kind you'd find at the entrance of a shopping mall, giving you a full view of the parking lot and the street beyond. But tonight, something about those windows made me feel uneasy. As I walked further down, the feeling of being watched intensified. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one there. Just the same emptiness. I quickened my pace, reaching the shelter near the old pet store at the far end of the hall. It had once been a place for people to drop off their pets for grooming, but it had been closed for years now. There was a small area inside where they used to keep stray animals, cats and dogs, some of them abandoned, others brought in by the mall's staff. The shelter had a glass window at the front, where you could see the animals lying in their cages. Most of the time, they were asleep or lazily stretching. Tonight, they were all awake. All of them. I noticed a few cats sitting in their cages, staring at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. The dogs, too, there were a few of them, some large, some small, were all staring at me from their cages. Not a single bark, not a single sound. They were perfectly still. Their eyes following my every movement as I walked past the window. I froze. Something wasn't right. I could feel a lump rising in my throat as I stared at the animals. It was almost as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. And it was at that moment that I felt it, a presence behind me. A weight, a coldness that pressed against my back. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. The hallway was as empty as before. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it intensified. I could hear the soft creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet, the eerie sound echoing down the empty corridor. I took a step forward, but my legs felt heavy, like they were moving through thick molasses. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. That something was following me. I broke into a fast walk, heading back toward the main hallway, my heart racing. As I approached the shelter again, the animals were still staring at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. The silence was deafening. I was almost at the end of the hall when I heard it. A soft click, followed by a slow dragging sound. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the far end of the hallway, just outside the shelter, I saw them. The shadows, long and dark, stretched across the floor, moving on their own. They weren't cast by any light. They seemed to have a life of their own, creeping toward me with slow, deliberate movements. The click of footsteps echoed from down the hall, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I wasn't alone. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps pounding against the floor as I sprinted toward the main area of the mall. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop running until I was outside the security office, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. For a moment, I stood there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I checked the cameras to see if anything had been caught on tape, but to my surprise, the footage from that part of the mall was corrupted. The feed showed static, and the timestamp was all over the place. I ran the footage back a few times, but there was nothing. Except the eerie, glitchy distortion. My heart raced as I watched the screen, trying to find something, anything that would explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. The rest of my shift dragged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I walked past the western end of the mall, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if something, or someone, was following me. That night, I didn't tell Derek. I couldn't. He would have laughed it off or chalked it up to paranoia. I didn't want to seem like I was losing my mind. But the next night, Derek and I were assigned to the same shift again. He noticed it too. "Man, do you feel that?" he asked as we walked toward the west side of the mall. I glanced at him, my heart pounding. I didn't want to say anything, but he had already seen it, he had felt it. The heavy air, the strange chill in the atmosphere, the sense of something following us. From that night on, things only got worse. Derek and I started hearing things, soft whispers in the empty hallways, footsteps that seemed to echo from far away but led to nowhere. And the animals in the shelter? They never stopped staring. The once innocent creatures had become something else, something unnatural. Every time we passed by, their eyes followed us with an intensity that left us uneasy. We eventually learned that the store at the far end of the West Wing, the one where the murder had taken place, had once been a pet store. It was no surprise to me anymore. Something about that place had changed. Something dark and twisted had taken root, and we were all trapped in its grip. I don't work there anymore. I couldn't. After a few months, I quit, and Derek wasn't far behind me. The place was no longer just a mall. It had become something else, a place where the dead lingered, where something malevolent watched from the shadows. To this day, I wonder if anyone else feels it, if the new security guards sense the presence. We couldn't escape. I've heard rumors that the mall is haunted, but I've never gone back to see for myself. Some things are better left unexplored. But every time I pass by Hawthorne Mall, I get that same feeling, that same cold, suffocating pressure. And I wonder, maybe, just maybe, it's still waiting for someone to walk down that West Wing. Story: The Midnight Tenant. I was 20 years old when I started my job as a night shift receptionist at a small, quiet apartment complex. It wasn't the most exciting position, but it paid the bills, and at the time, that's all I needed. The building was old, built in the late 70s, and had a reputation for being cheap and worn down. Most of the tenants were students, young professionals, and the occasional retired person who didn't mind the constant sound of traffic just outside. I'd never been afraid of the place, not really. Sure, it creaked and groaned at night, but that was just the building settling, right? It was late August when I took on the night shift, just before school started back up. I had taken over for the day receptionist, a woman named Claire, who was sweet but always seemed to rush out the door at the end of her shift, eager to get home. I wasn't bothered by that. People have lives to live, and night shifts are often thankless. But she always gave me this look, a strange, sympathetic gaze before leaving, like she knew something I didn't. The building had one front door that led into the lobby, and the rest were locked and only accessible with keycards. As a night receptionist, I handled incoming calls, emergency requests, and of course, the occasional late-night guest checking in. The hours were long, and the place had an eerie quiet about it, especially after midnight. The lights in the lobby flickered more than they should have, but again, nothing unusual for a building of that age. One night, around 2:30 a.m., things started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint immediately, but the air in the lobby seemed thicker than usual. The hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead was louder than normal. I was sitting behind the desk, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway behind the elevator bank. That wasn't strange. People walked down the halls at all hours. Some tenants were students with late-night study sessions, and others worked weird shifts. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked up from my phone, expecting to see one of the regulars, maybe someone heading out for a late-night smoke or just grabbing a snack from the vending machine. But no one was there. I glanced at the security monitor, which showed the entrance, the hallway, and the elevator banks. All clear. There was no movement anywhere. Maybe I was just tired, I thought, shaking it off and going back to my phone. But the footsteps, they had been clear and distinct. One set of footsteps. Steady, deliberate. Not the sound of someone in a rush, but someone moving with purpose. It was a few minutes later when I heard it again. Step, step, step. I stood up quickly and walked out into the hallway, calling out, "Hello?" There was no response. The hallway was empty, just like the monitor showed. I knew for a fact that no one had been in or out of the building in the last half hour. All the doors were locked, and the only people in the building were the regular tenants. None of them had been out, at least as far as I could tell. My heart started to race a little, but I brushed it off as nerves. It was late. I was tired. I went back to the desk, trying to focus on something else. But that night, I felt watched. There was a presence in the lobby, like someone, or something, was lurking just out of sight. Every time I glanced up, I half expected to see someone standing just behind the desk, but no one ever was. Around 3 a.m., the door opened. I didn't expect anyone, no one had been scheduled for check-in, and the building was usually quiet at this hour. I glanced up to see a man step inside. He looked to be in his late 30s, tall, well-dressed, with dark brown hair that fell in waves around his face. He was wearing a black jacket, and I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes were focused on the ground, avoiding eye contact. I smiled politely, greeting him. But he didn't answer. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice uncertain. He glanced up at me, his eyes shifting quickly, and said in a low voice, "I need a room for the night." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you a guest here? A tenant? I don't have you listed." He hesitated for a second, almost as though he was searching for the right words. "No, I'm not a tenant. I was just looking for somewhere to stay." At this point, I was getting a bad feeling, but it was my job to help, and I didn't want to be rude. There was a long pause, and I opened the booking system to look for any last-minute reservations. Nothing. No one had made a request for a room. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I don't have anything available. The hotel section is closed for the night." The man stared at me, and for a moment, I thought he might get angry. His gaze was intense. almost like he was trying to read me. I tried to remain calm, smiling politely and shifting uncomfortably in my seat. "I'm not asking for a hotel," he said, his voice still low. "Just somewhere to stay. I'll be quiet. I don't need much. Just a place to rest." I should have called security then. I should have made sure to follow the protocol. But I didn't. Something about the way he spoke, the quiet intensity in his voice, made me feel as though he wasn't a threat. He seemed harmless, even though my instincts told me otherwise. "I'm really sorry," I said again. "But there's nothing I can do. You'll have to come back tomorrow if you want to book a room." The man's face shifted. His expression tightened, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. A flicker, like a storm about to break. He straightened up, walking closer to the desk. "I think you're misunderstanding," he said, his voice even colder now. "I don't want to book a room. I just need a place to stay. You can help me. You just don't know it yet." I froze. Something in his voice, in the way he said that, made my blood run cold. But before I could react, he smiled, a tight, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes, and backed away. Slowly. "Don't worry," he said quietly, "I'll find my own way. I'll be fine." I barely had time to process what happened before the man turned and walked toward the door, slipping out without another word. I watched him through the security monitor as he exited into the night, his figure swallowed up by the streetlights outside. But I didn't feel any relief. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stayed up for hours, constantly checking the monitors and listening to the quiet buzz of the lobby lights. I wanted to call Claire and tell her about the encounter, but I didn't want to bother her. Besides, I wasn't sure if I had just overreacted. But the next morning, something strange happened. I checked the guest logs and discovered that the man wasn't listed anywhere. There was no record of him ever having entered the building. Not only that, but the room he had mentioned didn't exist. It was a vacant spot, a non-existent listing, that had never been booked. I didn't report the encounter immediately. Maybe I was in denial, or maybe I just didn't want to admit to myself that something weird had happened. But later, when I told Claire, she just stared at me. Her face was pale, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "You've seen him," she said softly. "That's the guy I warned you about." It turns out the man had been a recurring figure in the building for years, or at least someone who looked eerily similar. He had a reputation for showing up late at night, always asking for a place to stay, always seeming to avoid any record of his existence. Tenants claimed to see him in the halls from time to time, but when anyone tried to ask who he was, he vanished like a ghost. By then, I had already started noticing the odd, unsettling occurrences that people had warned me about. The strange cold spots in the hallway, the flickering lights, and the whispers that seemed to come from the walls. It wasn't long before I realized that the building was haunted, not by spirits, but by the strange, unpredictable presence of this man who would never be recorded, never checked in, but always seemed to be around. I don't work the night shifts anymore. And sometimes, when I walk past that building, I can't help but glance up at the dark windows, wondering if he's still there, waiting, watching, for the next person to make the mistake of letting him in. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.